Good evening. I'm Matthew Zelik. This is just a brief introductory video to a much larger story. I need some help spreading this story because it's important to do so. This is very awkward and personal for me. It involves my family and their wrongdoing. I typically wouldn't speak about these things, but right now America is going through a shift. People are starting to realize how corrupt our governments are. Our local, state, and federal governments are being scrutinized right now, and it's important that people be heard and that people speak on what's happening. Like I said, this is awkward, so I'm going to keep it informal, and I'm going to just not edit it, because if I try and edit this and piece together something that's perfect, I'll never get it out. So I've got a checklist, I've got some caffeine, and I'm just going to try and power right through this. I'm going to keep this mild so it doesn't get pulled down from social media platforms. One other thing that's important to know is there's a man who I'm not allowed to speak about. The court has ordered for me not to say his name or list his title in government on social media. So I'm going to refer to this man as Mr. Robber. I'm just going to jump right in, because going through the checklist has got to be more awkward than this introduction. Some basic background. My father was killed in 1985 while my mother was pregnant with me. He had two really good friends. The first friend I've already mentioned to you, Mr. Robber. The second friend's name was Joey. That's important because Joey has a sister named Sheila. Remember that name, it'll come into play later. After my father's death, my mother started dating a man named Scott Hewitt. Scott Hewitt's brother is Timothy Hewitt. He was a deputy sergeant at Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office before he retired not too long ago. His daughter's name was Suzanne. When I was 3, Scott married my mother, and Suzanne was basically my favorite person in the world. I didn't recognize it at the time, but Suzanne was showing signs of sexual abuse. Right around the time my mother married Scott, my mother and Suzanne's mother took us both to Sawgrass Mills Mall. I was the type of child that didn't mind basically running around by myself. I was caught riding my tricycle next to the main byway and got in trouble for it, so I wasn't easily scared. Something happened to us that day. I remember being in a room with a man by ourselves, and we were both traumatized. Suzanne later played a game with me. It's a pretty common game. I'll show you mine if you show me yours. I didn't know what she was talking about. She was 4, I was 3, and I just went along with what she said. When she saw that I had a penis, she about had a panic attack. She started screaming in terror, and, adults came in and saw what was going on. I also remember an inappropriate shower with Scott. My brother, myself, and Scott were in the shower. I was approximately 3 years old. That put my brother at 5. Scott made comments about our genitals, their size, the size of his genitals, things of that nature. I found it to be very odd. A few years later, the games started. My family moved to Southern Illinois, and Scott's drinking became problematic. He'd play the candy bar game where he'd do sternum wraps on us while he straddled us, and we'd have to name 5 candy bars in order for him to stop. He played the toss game. which I later discovered is a form of abuse. He would throw me or my brother at our younger sister, and this game was don't hurt your sister, land around her, don't land on her. She was injured. That was to provoke guilt in us. He blamed the injury on me personally in an attempt to shame me, make me feel complicit with the abuse, and to remain silent about the abuse. Scott also played a game with us called Stretch and Do It With Your Body, where we would take our legs and spread them apart and then push them back towards our heads. I remember one such time playing this game where he placed his pelvis against my pelvis area. General physical abuse, picking us up by our pants or our overalls, smacking us on the back of the head, things of that nature. When DCF was notified, there was coaching involved. We were told that if the government took us away, it would be like the movies. We would go live in an orphanage, some facility. It would be horrible. We'd be separated. Things of that nature. But prior to that, I remember being told in school that we could report things to adults. And I recall being threatened with death by Scott. He slammed his beer down on the table and said, "I'll kill you," when I told him that I had learned that we were allowed to tell adults things, and I was going to tell. Distancing. Anytime I would show that I trusted an adult or cared about an adult, they would be mocked. My teacher, Mrs. Lingle, preschool, I adored this woman, and my family made sure to ridicule me anytime I mentioned her name. This created a distance. I thought there was something wrong with her, or I thought I would be thought less of for associating with her or talking to her. This was effective. And my family moved back home to South Florida after spending 6 years, my elementary school years, minus 5th grade in Illinois. By that point, I had become the black sheep. I was the focus of the abuse. My family was generally neglectful. We were too young to be preparing our own food, but we were told to prepare our own food or not eat. So we ate a lot of easy to cook things like ramen. We were neglected as far as learning. We weren't taught basically anything about socializing. In fact, the opposite. We were sabotaged. The neighborhood we lived in was mostly black neighborhood, and Scott had told us that the black kids didn't like us. They only wanted to play with us for, our things. They wanted to come swim in the pool. They wanted to borrow our toys. Things of that nature. More distancing. But the friends that they did promote were people who were children of alcoholics, migrants, people who wouldn't tell, other abusers. Around that time, middle school, my parents started using me for child labor. I was made to mow lawns on the weekends with my stepfather. Dangerous conditions. He didn't really care, didn't really supervise, taught me how to use the mower and had me go mow. I was used to do this because he was mowing small lots that required push mower, and basically it's like hey, you got small hands. It was more tedious work, and he needed a second person to work with him on those jobs to make them go fast enough to make money. So I was selected for that. I was paid, but I wasn't allowed to not go to work. Um, Around that time, Mr. Robber also started beginning to use me for work. Um, odd jobs, things of that nature. Um, I was way too young, and I was not a licensed electrician or an apprentice, but he had me wire up an entire industrial building. Uh, just basic install for service. And I mean, it wasn't the code, and he had me use lubricant to put transmission fluid or hydraulic fluid to put the wires in place. Um, this is the kind of people we're dealing with here. So I was depressed. Um, my mother had basically also groomed me to not want to go to the doctor. I was depressed, and I was starting to become suicidal. I wasn't really having ideations yet, but I was not wanting to be alive. Um, my mother had told me that if I went to the doctor, that I'd be put on pills and people would think poorly of me. Children would reject me. I'd be made fun of. She used that as a way to keep me in check. Um, so at about 14 years old, I realized that she was separating me from a doctor because she didn't want me to tell them the truth. So I asked to go to the doctor. I said I didn't care. I didn't care about kids making fun of me. I told her I needed help. Um, she asked why I needed help, and I told her that I was beginning to think about killing myself. And her response to that was, just do it already. So I went upstairs and attempted to hang myself with a bed sheet, and I wasn't successful only because she came up shortly after and pulled me down. In high school is when I started to notice the corruption, mainly in law enforcement. I took the class U.S. Government and Law. I read about every state statute Florida had at that point. And when my friend was detained and being investigated for malicious mischief for being struck with a car, I told the deputy that I had witnessed the event and that he was struck by the car, that the account of the driver was not what she said. She was saying that he'd jumped up on her hood and kicked the windshield. My friend had an obvious bruise on his hip, and the deputy was still trying to charge him. It wasn't until I stated that I would like to file a attempted murder report with him that he decided he was going to let my friend go. The same friend was actually arrested and maliciously prosecuted for self-defense. He was surrounded by some kids. A boy who was jealous of his girlfriend wanted to fight him because they had just broken up and he had something to prove. So he forced the fight. My friend repeatedly said he didn't want to fight the kid. He said he was in a bad mood, and he said he was afraid that if he fought him, he would hurt him. When this kid approached my friend threw one blow. It was a headbutt, and it fractured this other kid's skull. But even though I tried to tell the deputies that this was the case, it was self-defense, they didn't want to buy it. They didn't want to believe it. They don't really care. That was the pattern I was seeing. If they can arrest somebody for something, they do it. That is, unless it's somebody like my brother, nephew of a deputy sergeant. My brother was allowed to drive without a license. He drove like the streets were a NASCAR track. And when he got caught, he was basically just told to do some community service and to get a license. About this time, I was starting to repress memories. And when I witnessed my brother abuse our cousins, two toddlers, and an elementary school girl, my brother and his girlfriend were taking couch cushions and slamming them into their tiny bodies so hard that they were bouncing off the sofa bed. And these children were already traumatized. I didn't know why they weren't waking up and why they weren't moving or protesting this being done to them. I didn't find out until much later that traumatized children will play dead. They won't move. Shortly after that, my brother left the home, and my best friend witnessed the youngest of these children being abused in I don't know the appropriate word I can use for YouTube, but that sort of manner, by his mother. When we reported this to my mother, she told us he didn't know what he saw. At that point, my friend was 16. He knew what he saw. He insisted. My mother again said, "You don't know what you saw." And when we insisted and pushed the issue that we knew what that act was, she said, "That's normal. All mothers do that." Not too long after that, there was a domestic assault and battery. I believe this domestic was because my mother spoke to her husband. And the abuser was my stepfather's adopted sister. I believe my stepfather's adopted sister was coercing the family into providing housing and money for her. They were passing her around from house to house, taking turns taking care of her. I think she was extorting them. I think my mother had had enough and wanted to report this abuse and brought it up to him. I know about this domestic abuse because my mother screamed for help. I came running into the room, and my father had her pinned. I don't like calling him that. My stepfather had her pinned backwards over the bed with a ceramic lamp raised over his head, ready to bring it down. I came into the room just in time to punch him and tackle him and keep that from happening. My stepfather wasn't happy that he was bleeding from his eye after I punched him once. He called the deputies and told them that my mother did it. They tried to arrest her. I had to threaten to go to jail with my mother and tell the judge everything in order to get them to release her. They took my stepfather to the hospital to get stitches and then to his brother's house to sleep off the drunk. He was back the next day. I went to a party. I was invited to a party along with the rest of the members of my band. And when I arrived there, I knocked on the door. Approximately 8 men fled the scene. A minor came out of the back room and started screaming, "Call the police." I was just gang assaulted in a manner that I can't say the name of. When her friend called the police, PBSO deputies showed up. and coerced her out of reporting. They said that if she reported, that they were going to look into her underage friends' consumption of alcohol and potentially drugs, that they'd charge her friend. When I protested, they told this girl that she wanted it and she was just sobering up. And when I told them that intoxicated people can't consent, they said that if they launched an investigation, that I would be suspect number one. I tried to forget all this. I tried to move on. I moved to Southern Illinois to live with my grandparents. I couldn't bear it. I came back down to Florida and I made a second suicide attempt. I was 18 at the time and I had bought my first shotgun. I put the shotgun towards my mouth and was getting ready to pull the trigger. And my friend knocked on the door. I went to the door and he asked me if I still wanted to join the Marine Corps, something we had talked about and I had tried to do when I was 17. So I joined the Corps. When I was in the Marine Corps, I was expecting it to be an honorable place. One of the reasons why me and my friend had spoken of joining was because we took history of Vietnam War and we read about how Marines had honor, Australian commandos had honor, and everyone else was basically a bunch of jerks. The Marine Corps did seem to have a little bit more honor than the other branches, but it still had its problems, like Chadwick Damon. I was told to arrest Chadwick Damon because we had evidence that he was sleeping with a 14-year-old girl. I went and arrested him with my corporal. I was very upset when my command decided not to prosecute him, not to throw him in the brig. They just let him out with I believe, a bad conduct discharge. I started the protest, but I was told by my staff sergeant that this would just end up ruining my career, and the command's mind was already made up. I later learned that Chadwick Damon went on to kill a 2-year-old girl. He beat her to death. My brother used to call me while I was in service, drunk and suicidal, talking about wrapping his truck around a telephone pole, things of that nature. He had moved home with my parents because things weren't going well. And I think that living with them was triggering CPTSD, making him suicidal. When I was in Iraq, I was hazed. I was hazed because I wrote a report at the request of a Marine who was being charged by the command. The command was claiming that he physically abused me, which he never had. That was all my report said. When I tried to report the hazing, I was denied legal. So I did the next best thing and asked to see the chaplain. I didn't know the chaplain was good friends with the command, or members of my command. He ended up writing a report that had me sent to medical. They took my weapon away. It was embarrassing and degrading. But that was the beginning of my medical record. When I got back from Iraq, my friend committed a crime against a woman. It was minor as far as those type of crimes go. Just a basic, kind of thing. But that was still disturbing to me, and what was more disturbing was his punishment. When reported to proper legal authority was to sweep and mop floors for a few weeks. After that, members of the command that I deployed with in Iraq were tasked with forming a new unit. I was one of the NCOs in that unit, and I think they were trying to keep me from gaining higher billet and working my way up. I basically was doing the right thing, and I was reporting things that they didn't want to report. They got in trouble for it. So there was an incident where I was set up. I believe one of these individuals was trying to antagonize me into a fight so they could get me in trouble. And I walked away. I told them I felt like fighting them, and I walked away. I was told to report to medical, and when I reported to medical, I was diagnosed with adjustment disorder, which is a stress disorder similar to PTSD. On my way out of the Marine Corps, I got a going away present. It wasn't the kind I wanted. It was me having to witness two fellow Marines abuse a recruit. They did it in front of me because they knew if I reported it, I'd be placed on legal hold and kept in the Marine Corps. The good news on that one is that recruit got exactly what he wanted. He was trying to get out of the Marine Corps. I'm not proud I didn't report that. I wish that recruit would have. I would have testified. Also, on my way out of the Marine Corps, I contacted a man who went by the name July 4 Patriot on YouTube before. This was Sergeant Charles Dyer. He was working with the Oath Keepers. He was speaking about corruption in government. And his story is an interesting one. But how it relates to my story is I sent him an email the day before he was arrested for domestic terrorism. I don't believe he was a domestic terrorist. Just prior to getting out of the Marine Corps as well, Mr. Robber, he framed his wife, which was my aunt, for domestic battery. He did so because she was divorcing him, because he was committing crimes, financial crimes as well. She is a certified accountant, worried about losing her accounting license, and when she found out what he was doing, she knew she had to divorce him. It was already coming because of his abusive nature, but that was the icing on the cake. He was trying to gain custody of the kids, not because he wanted them, but to hurt my aunt. After I got out of the Marine Corps, Criminal Investigative Division came to my home and wanted to search it for property that was stolen in a crime that I was not involved in. It was in a different unit. The suspect was in a different unit, but they wanted to come search me. I believe this was them fishing. They were looking for something. After service, I moved to Orlando to be close to my brother. He'd gotten a job there. He took me out downtown, and his friend got arrested. His friend should have been arrested because he reached behind a bar and grabbed a bottle of liquor. I've got no problem with that, but I have a problem with what the arresting officer did. He's blocking the exit. The street was blocked off for festivities every weekend, and there was only 2 entrances and exits. He was blocking one of the main ones, and a girl was trying to get by him. She looked at him, made eye contact with him. Her body language was indicative of, is it okay for me to pass? The officer looked right at her. Didn't say anything to the negative, wait a minute, anything like that. So she starts to go behind him, staying as far away from him as possible, keeping her hands visible out to her sides as a sign of respect. This officer watched her do this and then immediately turned around and face masked her. She hit the ground hard. Most of the men who saw this happen immediately rushed this officer. He drew his taser in defense. I had to restrain my brother from attacking him. I tried to get this girl to report. She agreed. I asked them to call for their sergeant. The sergeant showed up. And this girl was pulled to the side and left with tears in her eyes, saying to me, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." I don't know what they said to her, but I do know that they tried to gather information on me. They knew who my brother's friend was. I think they drew a correlation there and a connection there. Shortly after that, while I was going to my brother's house, an unmarked vehicle pulled up behind me while I was at his gate. I was using the pin. I was putting in the pin to dial his phone number for the second time. This truck came up behind me. A man stepped out with a gun in his hand and started screaming, "Who are you? What the F are you doing here?" I said I was going to my brother's house. He asked for the address. This whole time, I was regretting leaving my concealed carry weapon at home. I knew I had my backup weapon in the hatch of my hatchback, but I knew if I tried to get to it, I'd be killed. This man said, "Leave and don't ever come back," and then walked back to his vehicle and flipped on the low pro code lights. I realized it was an officer who was plainclothes in an unmarked vehicle. Seeing that girl be abused and it be covered up, seeing that recruit being abused, seeing all this corruption had me severely depressed. I'd lost my friends in the Marine Corps by, leaving them behind. And I had basically no support structure. My mother convinced me to move back home, and at that time, I still was repressing memories from childhood. So I thought it was a good idea. She said she would help. She'd provide a safe environment. When I moved in with my mother, she set me up with an appointment with Dr. Agresti. He evaluated me. He didn't find any signs of schizophrenia, anything like that. That's relevant because shortly after this, the VA is going to claim that I'm basically an insane person. Dr. Agresti diagnosed me with major depressive disorder, put me on an antidepressant. I went to the VA because I didn't have health insurance, and they switched up the medication but were treating me for the same. My stepfather started abusing me again, but this time it was mostly psychological. He'd still occasionally physically abuse me, but I think that was more psychological as well. A smack on the back of the head to a grown man who can seriously hurt him is more of a "I can do this to you" type of thing. But that's what he continued to do. I was having issues with sleeping, at nighttime especially. I realize now that was from both my service, doing night missions, sleeping during the day. Daytime is safe time. We own the night. And during avoidance from childhood, staying up late to enjoy myself, knowing that I'm safe because everyone else is asleep. So I talked to the doctors about this, and they said, tell your stepfather to stop doing that. Because my mother was telling me, you need to sleep at night. The doctor said, you need to sleep when you can sleep. I informed my mother and stepfather of this. The abuse continued until I started waking them up in the middle of their sleep cycles. Then it stopped. I started getting sleep. I started socializing with my friends more. I started to wake up. And I started to seek God. I started reading the Bible. And I realized I needed to get out of that house. I had loaned my parents $40,000. So I decided to move to Southern Illinois where the living's cheap and my grandparents were. I wanted to spend some quality time with them, buy a cheap home, renovate it, and start going back to college. I'd only just enrolled in college and was waiting for fall semester to start up when my mother planned a vacation. I didn't know this at the time, but my mother was telling my grandparents that the $800 check she was sending me monthly were the only way I was supporting myself. The truth was that was her paying back the $40,000 loan. She was waging character assassination on me because before I left I made the mistake of pointing out that I remembered the abuse, that they were still abusing me. That's why I'd asked for them not to contact me. Well, my mother contacted me against my wishes anyways. She begged me to come down to Florida and go on a cruise that she was planning, a family vacation. She begged me to do it for my relatives, told me that I could avoid her and my stepfather if I wanted, and to just come down for them. When I came down, my mother had me Baker acted. She was friends with a staff member at the VA, a registered nurse herself, and she told the doctors there that I was basically a raving lunatic. I don't really blame them for what they did. They were trying to protect a woman who was very convincing in her lies. But I do blame them for using a 5-point restraint on me after administering 2 different types of chemical restraints, sedatives, an illegal practice. And I do blame them for covering up their illegal act once I complained by stacking my records full of a bunch of reports that follow in the likeness of my mother's. He's schizophrenic. He's a madman. He's aggressive. He might hurt somebody. We need to medicate him heavily. Don't listen to his delusions. That's where I'm at right now in life. That's where I was, and after I got out of that Baker Act ward with the whole world coming down on me, or at least what I viewed as the whole world coming down on me, I ended up going to my mother's doctor when she was trying to have me Baker acted again, Dr. May. Dr. May said the same thing as Dr. Agresti, but also diagnosed me with some trauma. The agreement was, if Dr. May said, I've got a clean bill of health as far as schizophrenia or any of those disorders that require antipsychotic medications, that my mother would stop nagging me about going off my meds. I thank Dr. May for being honest and doing that for me. So I got off the meds. I started to get my head straight, but I was still living with my parents because after I was medicated, I completely forgot why I had left Florida in the first place. I was starting to come back into it, and I started dating a girl who I'd dated for a while I was in service. We moved in together, and I started seeing her family doctor. Her family doctor, Miss Mack, awesome lady. She was the first person to give me therapy for my trauma. I had a lot of breakthroughs. I was ready to move on with my life. And she figured out the reason for my depression was I was trying to follow everyone else's dreams and not follow my own. Because what I really wanted to do was be a gunsmith. I found the technology fascinating. I was good at it. I did it as a hobby while I was in the Marine Corps. And I was accepted into school and advanced on the wait list because they liked my essay. So it was very disappointing when on the third day of gunsmith school I found out that I was erroneously placed on the prohibited persons list. The FBI had notified the Colorado Bureau of Investigations that I was adjudicated mentally defective. This was false. I was never afforded due process. Only later would I find out that I was able to be placed on this list erroneously because of an Obama-era executive order that said veterans with a mental health claim and a fiduciary could be placed on the list. I had no fiduciary. I didn't meet the criteria, but I was placed on the list anyway. I believe this might have had something to do with my mother and her contact with the VA. I contacted my aunt because I was told she might be able to help me. She had a lawyer friend who looked into this and couldn't find out much, but recommended I move back to Florida and go through the legal process of reversing this adjudication, which turned out to be impossible, essentially, because there was no adjudication. I wasn't notified of one, and they thought that potentially that might have been the issue, that I was notified and they proceeded without me. But that wasn't the case. So my ex tried to give me one of the dogs that we shared. We had split up after I became depressed, having my dreams wrecked. I wanted her to move on with her life, and I knew that I was going to have issues moving on with mine. I didn't want her to have to go through that fight with me. So she tried to give me the dog, and I tried to take it, but I was staying with my parents temporarily until I found a residence, and they insisted I give my dog to my sister's boyfriend. Around this time, I found a room to rent, and I started drinking heavily. I realized that I wasn't going anywhere with getting this egregious placement reversed. My family's best advice was go to Mr. Robber for help because he's connected. And Mr. Robber, a veteran himself, said, "You're diagnosed with PTSD. Do you really think that you should be accepting a disability claim and owning guns at the same time?" I actually let that get to me, and I gave up because I respected Mr. Robber. He was friends with my father and pretended to care about me and look out for me, when what he was really doing was engaging in the family game of abusing children. Around that time, I was assaulted by a motorcycle gang. I was battered by one of the members. I tried not to engage in this fight, but their prospect was drunk and had an issue with me for some reason. They were with a man who knew where my parents live and thought I still lived there. And after I defended myself and embarrassed their prospect, one of them said, "You know where he lives, right?" The man who knew where my parents lived. And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "We will see him later." So my friends calmed me down and got me drunk. They dropped me off at home, and I remembered that the "we'll see him later" threat was made. I was worried about my family. Even though I didn't want contact with them, I called every phone in the house 3 times before I decided to call 911 and let them know about the assault and asked them to do a health and welfare check. The dispatcher had me walk to an intersection to meet the deputies because they couldn't find the location of my home. They tried to arrest me on fabricated charges, public intoxication, abuse of the 911 line, DUI. They didn't stop trying to fabricate charges and go check on my family until I told them that the man that I was asking them to check on was a relative of a deputy. My sister's boyfriend was using steroids. My mother, a registered nurse, insisted on injecting them. When my sister's boyfriend made threats to her, she called 911. The deputies that responded refused to do anything. I know they refused to do anything because they called up the family to get the full story. What should we do about this kid is the way it goes when they're connected or affiliated, even loosely, with law enforcement. So I'm sure that those deputies knew that if they arrested my sister's boyfriend, that he would likely retaliate by claiming in his defense that my mother was injecting him with steroids. She would have lost her nursing license. So instead, my sister calls me upset. She's upset that the deputies did nothing, and I was halfway into a bottle of whiskey. I went to my sister's boyfriend's house because I had asked where the dogs were. My dog that I gave him and her dog that she had bought to be a companion. She said they were at his house, so I went and got the dogs, and I dropped them off at my parents' house. My mother, whose husband drove around for decades drunk, called deputies because she was upset that I was driving drunk and sticking up for my little sister, and taking the dogs out of a home where the man was obviously having some issues with roid rage. The deputies showed up, had witnessed no crime, detained me for an unreasonable amount of time, tried to get me to incriminate myself, and when I refused, brutalized me, slammed me face down while I was in handcuffs, injured my wrist, a lasting injury that I still feel pain from today. Went to the VA the next day at the request of my grandfather. The VA refused to treat my injuries because they knew they were from police and didn't want to document them. That's how it is. They look out for each other. I did manage to get transferred. My social worker transferred me out to a state-run facility where they treated my injuries. So there are records of this. My grandfather, who witnessed this event, is now deceased. I protested the arrest of Arnold Abbott for feeding the homeless. Fort Lauderdale police arrested him because the city had passed a law against feeding the homeless. Their SWAT team special events coordinator posed as an agent provocateur and tried to turn our peaceful protest into an unlawful assembly. We tried to report this because we identified the man. We caught him on film. They did nothing. I started getting more treatment and working on myself more after I got out of treatment that last time I referred to. I started going to a 12-step program, and memories started flooding back from doing the work and going through the steps and having a support group. One of these memories was about some child abuse of the worst kind of nature. I couldn't remember what the man's face looked like, so I had qualms about making any accusations. But I brought this up to family members, and I was told that it was a false memory. When I told my aunt, she burst into tears and said they did the same thing to me. When I thought it was my stepfather and I accused him, this led to a mental breakdown where I ended up in the VA Baker Act ward again. My grandfather came in there to visit me and admitted to me that he did horrible things when he was drunk when I asked why I should forgive my stepfather. I tried to report some children playing with BB guns in an alley. I didn't want to call 911 because I was afraid something might happen. That these children might be harmed because cops can get overzealous. So I went and approached some West Palm Beach police officers, Thelton Luke being one of them, at downtown Clematis. Thelton Luke got upset that I was asking for his help. Basically, he didn't want to do anything for me. He was trying to identify me when I was just trying to develop a rapport with him. He was trying to get my address to see if we actually can work for you. Officer Luke didn't know that I knew that whole line. That's BS. That's a way to get somebody's address. So if you don't like what they do, you can loiter around their place and arrest them. And I didn't recognize Officer Luke at that point, but I later remembered that he was an officer that I reported hearing gunshots to at the corner, who said, "I'm eating lunch. There's a lot of gunshots in this neighborhood, man. Get used to it." So that interaction with Officer Luke turned into a simple battery on myself. It wasn't anything to get worried about or worked up about, except for the fact that this is a cop whose job is to protect people, not to intimidate them and to touch them when they don't want to be touched. I tried to report it. His sergeant said, just like this, "I watched his body camera. That didn't happen." Showing that it wasn't caught on the body camera, so he wasn't going to hold his officer accountable. Officer Luke's partner told me to look him up and said, "You seem hysterical, man." So I looked him up, later, I found out that Thelton Luke was involved in the death of Donald Lewis. They broke the man's neck, crushed his trachea. The police coroner said he died from hysterical delirium. That was a threat on my life. Later, other Palm Beach police officers would falsely arrest me. Officer Luke was asking for my address and I refused to give it. I was told by a bouncer when he saw me that the police were looking for me. He asked if my name was Zeke, and I said, no, but that's close enough. Why are you asking? And he says, the police are looking for you. Shortly after that, a few weeks later, one of these officers spotted me, falsely arrested me, and said, we got your address now, to mock me, as he twisted my arm in an unnecessary arm bar because I was not resisting. After that release, officers witnessed me being punched in the head. I fell, and I think I lost consciousness. Well, I know I lost consciousness for a short period of time. I was drinking, but officers called an ambulance and threw me into it and told them that I had alcohol poisoning. I had a ring print in my forehead. I wasn't checked at the hospital for a head injury because of their false report. I tried to move away from South Florida again. After that incident, I decided to sober up again. And I tried to move away again. It went horribly. And I ended up back at my parents' house only temporarily until I could fix my air conditioning. So during that time, while I was staying there briefly, my stepfather tried to take an object and put it in a place that would be very unpleasant for my mother. She cried for help. Me running towards the cries for help was enough to stop his attack. The next day he was bragging about this attack to my cousin's husband, who was recently given a job at the Palm Beach Police Department. Even though he was bragging right in front of a law enforcement officer, that didn't seem to help my case when I later reported this. My mother was threatening to have me Baker acted again, and I felt like something bad was going to happen, so I insisted we all go see her doctor again, Dr. May. Well, I insisted that this time the three of us, my mother, my stepfather, and Dr. May, have a sit down. This was a good move on my part. My mother tried to get Dr. May to back her up. She was trying to get him to institutionalize me, essentially, and Dr. May saw right through it. Told her she was abusing me, told him he was abusing me, told me that I needed to report this. Dr. May knew I had issues with the VA, but he said, go in there calm and collected and ask them for legal assistance. Told me I'd need outpatient therapy. if I was going to go through the legal process without a mental breakdown. So I went in there and asked the VA for that. And I ended up getting sent to Dr. Ville to do an assessment. Dr. Ville was one of the doctors that was part of the inappropriate medical treatment, the malpractice, criminal malpractice. And he tossed me in the Baker Act ward. Me and him do not get along. I asked for another doctor. And I was placed in the Baker Act ward under the oral orders of Dr. Ville. But I found out later that another doctor covered for him by filling out the paperwork. And my Baker Act, the official paperwork, was filed after I was in the 3C ward. So they initiated a Baker Act on me before they had initiated a Baker Act on me. Crimes to cover crimes. I got out and I tried to leave again. My stepfather stole a check, approximately $1,600, that I needed for the move because I just spent a lot of money. Spent a lot of money taking care of a dog. Pitbull came to my front door and he was used as a bait dog, and I basically emptied my checking account to get him patched up. I wanted to keep him and I wanted to move, but my stepfather came to my house, my home, which was a studio apartment my aunt was renting me illegally. So there was no lease. It would have been my word versus her word. My stepfather threatened my life. He told me if I didn't stop trying to report crimes that I would end up killed the same way Seth Adams was, and Seth Adams was killed by a deputy. I said that was a murder to him, and he said, yeah, and that cop won't spend a day behind bars. He told my aunt, who didn't like pit bulls, like dogs, she just didn't like pit bulls. She was an ER nurse. Pretty sure he told her about the dog because the next day I was forced to give up the dog or be put out on the street, and I still regret not just going and living in my truck. There were no kill shelters available to take that animal at that time, and I don't know what happened to him. Because I had spoken with my mother about the stolen check and also about why she was threatening to have me Baker Acted again. I confronted her that time and wouldn't take no for an answer. I wanted to hear why she was trying to have me Baker Acted after we'd gone through this. Her doctor said, you know, she was abusive, he was abusive, and I was good to go. And she said, they're going to kill you, and I'd rather you be in a mental facility than be killed. So my mother had agreed then, after that conversation, to pay all my bills so that way I could save the money that I would have spent on my bills and use that to move. I found out about a week after Scott came and threatened my life that she had not been paying the bills, and now I was in a worse off financial situation. So I snapped. I've been living in fear. I've been waiting for the knock on my door from the sheriff's office, the one that was going to be them coming to kill me. Because they knew I was on the prohibited persons list, and they knew that I had a weapon. All it would have taken was one health and welfare check, and they could have assassinated me. Scott knew that. My mother knew that. I knew that. So I snapped. I went to my stepfather's home, used my training, did a covert entry, woke him up at gunpoint, and had him call his deputy brother. His deputy brother agreed to look into pressing charges to stop protecting him if I put down the gun. So I did, and I went and turned myself into the VA. That was a lie, and Tim's name was kept out of the reports. So that way the courts wouldn't be able to link him to the case. Anyone who knows anything about law would know that a correlation like that, a connection like that, would lead to a conflict of interest, likely a change of venue, and potentially a conflict of interest attorney. My rights to due process were violated. Rather than let me take it to trial, which my first public defender wanted to do, she thought there was a pretty good chance we could get off with an objective entrapment defense or a jury nullification, and I believed the same because I was a military police officer. I knew what I was doing. I was trying to get in front of a judge. I was trying to expose what was going on. I made the mistake of trusting my brother to be a liaison between me and my second public defender. My brother, when I called him, told me that they were going to offer me a plea deal, that I was going to be allowed to go to the Miami PTSD treatment program for a year. It was an inpatient outpatient program. It sounded strange because it's a 9-month program, and he said a year, and he basically told me that they were making special arrangements for me, and they were going to have me stay inpatient for a full 12 months. He said that if I went through the program for a year, that I would be released so long as the doctors said there were no major issues and charges would be dropped. My public defender came just prior to my hearing and said, "Do you want to do the hospital deal?" I said, "Yes." She said, "All right, you have to keep your mouth shut. No matter what you hear in there, just keep your mouth shut and I will get you the deal." I said, "Okay." So my public defender brought my competency into question, an area of law that I was a little less familiar with. It did sound kind of funny, and I wasn't sent to the VA PTSD treatment program in Miami. I was sent to a forensic treatment center. I wasn't released after a year with charges dropped. I was still facing a conviction. So this is a lie, a conspiracy between my brother and my public defender. The prosecutor in my case got to hear my entire story during a confidential sanity evaluation that couldn't be used against me in the court of law. She was left in tears. I heard her say to my public defender, "I feel so bad," as I was walking out the door. My public defender was less sympathetic than my prosecutor. And rather than fighting for my civil rights, ended up trying to get me to roll over and accept 10 years of probation and a felony conviction. I knew that would probably be a death sentence to me, having to live in Palm Beach County for 10 years. So I went to Mr. Robber for help. At the advice of my grandfather, Mr. Robber knows lawyers and powerful people. He's a powerful person himself. He's involved in government. And he had asked me to vote for him. Told me he would give me the day off of work, because while I was released awaiting trial, I was working for Mr. Robber. He arranged a meeting with an attorney named Franklin Prince. Franklin Prince made it very clear that he was doing a favor for Mr. Robber And there were conditions to what he would do for me based on what Mr. Robber wanted. Things like not bringing up the past. Something that would be beneficial to argue for a better plea deal. I believe this was legal malpractice. Also, when I got out, I found out that the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department had searched my home and thousands of dollars worth of my property was missing. I'm really upset they took my father's knife. You know, he's deceased. I can't get that back. And they took the knife that I carried in Iraq. These are family heirlooms, you know. The monetary value of the other things is insignificant, but the priceless nature of the things that they took is very upsetting. Mr. Robber and my grandfather on my father's side had worked out an arrangement while I was being held in the Forensic Treatment Center. I was to work for Mr. Robber. He was going to give me a good reference as an employer and help me get off probation as early as 2.5 years. This story Mr. Robber was selling me and my grandfather started to fall apart when my probation officer was asking for my references, for my employer's information. Mr. Robber was like, "Oh no, you're an independent contractor." He was trying to avoid paying taxes. I started to realize that Mr. Robber was not going to help me out. He wasn't going to give a reference. He was just using me for my labor like he used to when I was a child. I needed a mental health day. I was having a bad day. I was triggered. I was going through it. And I tried to get the day off, and Mr. Robber insisted that I stay and work. And, he was calling me weak, basically, telling me I needed to move on, and I told him how this assault that happened when I was a child was still affecting me, and I was still facing legal consequences due to the fallout of it. And I basically said, "What has happened to you so bad in your life?" And that triggered him. He told me a story about a similar assault that he and his sister endured when they were children. And this concerned me because I had had some suspicions about Mr. Robber in the past and about his proclivities, specifically involving his niece, the daughter of his sister. And that seemed to make sense. They were abused, and then they began inappropriate behavior together and with her child, and that would make sense, seeing as how my grandfather was accused by his daughter. Abusive people marry abusive people when they turn into abusers so they can perpetuate the cycle. And that's what I was starting to see. And the final straw was when Mr. Robert's brother told me that it was messed up that he I pointed out that I was happy to see that at least Mr. Robber was changing his mind about being a racist because his grandchildren were mixed. And his brother told me that was That was one of the worst things, was having to hide the fact that he had to prevent Mr. Robber from murdering these children's father. He was intent, he had a plan, he called up his brother to help, and his brother showed up to stop him, had to physically restrain him. So I devised going to college as an escape plan. My grandfather wanted me working for Mr. Robber, and I didn't want to have a fallout with my grandfather. Our relationship was on shaky ground. Mr. Robber had filled his head with the idea that I was a lazy bum, a pothead, an idiot. I didn't meet my grandfather until I was 30 because he was one of the people that my family isolated me from. Mr. Robber finally arranged the meeting. He had kept in touch because he was friends with my father, and he knew my grandfather had a substantial amount of money. So I believe he was just trying to stay friendly and get himself written into the will, because Mr. Robert seemed to talk my grandfather out of writing 2 people out of his will, out of the 3 that were in it. So Mr. Robert was also pretending like he was there for my grandfather, like he pretended to be there for me. He neglected my grandfather's medical treatment. My grandfather almost died from a hernia. He called me after it had ruptured. He waited days. My grandfather wanted to die at that point. He was trying to let himself degrade into death, but his medical condition was good enough where that wasn't a possibility. And I convinced him that that wasn't the way to go. I convinced him to get better treatment, more treatment. He could afford it. He had insurance. And I confronted Mr. Robber about his lack of oversight on something he said he was looking after. I told Mr. Robber that if he was going to manage my grandfather's medical treatment, that he needed to provide him with an in-home care nurse, and potentially a housekeeper, just 2 people to come by and help him. And he found somebody who could fit both bills. Sheila, my father's friend's sister, Mr. Robert's ex-fiancée or ex-girlfriend. I don't recall which one. Mr. Robert had a lot of fiancées. But he placed this woman in charge of caring for my grandfather. She was going to his house for a couple hours a day, cooking a meal, cleaning up a little bit, making sure he took his meds, billing him $600 a day. I didn't know about that, or I would have done something about that. By the end of a month or so after becoming her caretaker, Sheila had me pretty well convinced she was a decent person. My grandfather paid off her car, and I wasn't complaining about it. She had a disabled son, and I thought it was a kind thing that my grandfather was doing. Mr. Robert came into my grandfather's home while Sheila had him out at an appointment. I believe they coordinated this. He took his guns from his gun safe. He took his estate paperwork. I found out about this because I bought my grandfather some optics for Christmas. He had Sheila escort me to the safe and open it up for me because he knew I was a felon, or I was on felony probation, and was not allowed to be given access to guns, so he was doing the right thing there. She opened the safe and I saw that it had been ransacked, and I put the optics inside, and she motioned for me to go outside and to be quiet about it. And she told me that Mr. Robber had come and taken the stuff while they were out for an appointment. Not to tell my grandfather about it because his medical condition was not so good at the time. It had degraded from where it was previously, and he was on chemotherapy fighting cancer, but his prognosis was good. She just said that his heart might give out if he got too worked up. So I agreed. I told her to notify me immediately when his condition improved enough to tell him. He found out anyways, and Sheila didn't mention the fact that we had that discussion. Just kind of let him assume things about me. That upset my grandfather. Also around that time, I witnessed what I thought was some trafficking of children. My neighbors appeared to be running an illegal immigration house. Their house was being used as a temporary stop, likely in a chain of places to go. Migrant workers in and out. This was a studio apartment. This was a place fit for maybe 4 people. At times there were 8, 10 people there. When one of these men brought a small child to my door and said something to me in Spanish about De Niro, I wasn't quite ready to turn them in. I thought he might have been asking me for money and using the child to make me feel guilty for not giving them something. But part of me thought that my intuition was saying he was trying to prostitute this girl out. When another girl ran from the home to me with tears in her eyes, I knew immediately that something was wrong, and I contacted DCF, who declined to do anything. They told me I needed to contact PBSO, and I knew contacting PBSO would do nothing because every time I've tried to report a crime to them, I've been denied the ability to report. It's a violation of U.S. code. It's occurred multiple times. I did report this incident when my neighbor on the other side assaulted me. He was a drug dealer. He was trying to get me to join his gang. When I refused, he got worried, and he was trying to get my probation violated by starting something with me because he knew my situation. He knew that they would arrest me, not him. So when I called the police there, when the deputies arrived, I reported. I reported my neighbor who had just assaulted me, and they wouldn't let me report. When I demanded a paper report to file out myself, I was told I would be placed in a patrol vehicle and driven to the hospital to be Baker acted. So I told them if they didn't care about what was going on between me and them, they should look into the child trafficking at least. So I did report it to them at that point. Shortly after that, I was the victim of an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, assault with a firearm. And a man pointed a pistol in my face in a Publix parking lot because he didn't like being told that he was being a rude jerk, basically. That was all it took to make him flip out. Um, I'm almost positive it was caught on camera. Again, when deputies arrived, they pulled up. If you try and report anything, we're going to throw you in the loony bin. Uh, my grandfather made a suicide attempt under suspicious circumstances. My brother beat me to the hospital. My brother lives in Orlando. I live closer to the hospital than my grandfather. And Sheila, the person who claims she found my grandfather, was at my grandfather's house. All three of them beat me to the hospital when I got the call when allegedly Sheila was just leaving his house to catch up with him. So I'm pretty sure this was planned. My aunt was pretty sure this is planned. Essentially, it was an assisted suicide. And Mr. Robber, Sheila, and my brother were going to split the money from his estate. They had him wrapped around their fingers, and I was just trying to spend some quality time with my grandfather, and I didn't want him to be paranoid. So after my grandfather died 3 days later in the hospital, which was also suspicious because Sheila was there, to the best of my knowledge. She's a registered nurse. She knows as well as any other registered nurse, if you want to kill your patient, you just put some insulin into their PICC line. And my grandfather wanted to die. He didn't want to go to a facility, which is what they were going to do. So his heart failed. The doctors were confused because he had been stepped down. They weren't expecting that. So I started reporting this stuff. DCF, State's Attorney, Internal Affairs. Because when Mr. Robber had taken the guns, one of which is a sawed-off shotgun with no tax stamp, Mr. Robber had sent the guns home with some deputies. Now, I'm not allowed to say what position Mr. Robber is in exactly, but he has a vote in whether PBSO contract with an area is renewed. Multi-million-dollar contract. So when I was talking about how they overlooked this shotgun, Internal Affairs said they'd look into it. I know now that Internal Affairs essentially did more character assassination and just slanted the report to make it seem like I was angry. I was angry my grandfather had cut me out of the will. Which I wasn't. My grandfather had made arrangements for me to be taken care of. No. Internal Affairs failed to even mention this shotgun in the report. I knew when they kicked back the report as unfounded, essentially. No further action required. I knew that I was BS, but before I got the report, I filed with FDLE because I was told by their Internal Affairs Department that FDLE is to investigate internal affairs. Apparently I can't get an answer on who investigates internal affairs because FDLE kicked back my complaint and said, we don't investigate unless it's on behalf or at the request of another law enforcement agency. We're not the internal affairs for internal affairs, basically. My report to the Department of Justice, that went nowhere. They sent me back a bunch of computer code, basically. It's like binary with a bunch of characters in it. It's not legible English. I tried for weeks to get them to send me something that I could read or answer me over the phone. They're ignoring me. And Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office knows about this shotgun, but it's listed nowhere in the paperwork. So I was on curfew when I started trying to report Mr. Robber. I had a PBSO vehicle block me into a parking stall. It seems that they were checking my routine and realized that I would go to the corner store on my way home just prior to curfew to pick up any items I might need because I wouldn't be allowed to leave. So they blocked me in the parking stall, and I saw several PBSO vehicles make the turn into my neighborhood, probably staging for the arrest. And the vehicle didn't move until I walked behind it and started filming its information. So, camera saved my butt on that. Shortly after that, there was a PBSO came by to do a welfare check. I think they were trying to rile me up there. Luckily, the deputies they sent were pretty afraid. I was staying in my grandfather's house at that point, and my grandfather had "I shoot trespassers" painted in bright, gigantic red letters on his fence. And so I was arrested again. Mr. Robber made some allegations to PBSO deputies. My home was searched. I was never provided with a warrant. During the time where my home was searched, I wasn't allowed access to the phone. I was trying to seek a real attorney. I was trying to get some representation that would actually do something. But my home was searched without a warrant. The neighbors all saw it. My public defender tried to pretend like it didn't happen. They were trying to do the whole "we'll play he's crazy" thing again. I was arraigned. I wasn't given paperwork. This is done over video conference. And basically, I'm being railroaded. I don't think my public defender is actually going to give me a defense. I haven't been able to retain an attorney because they brought my competency into question, and when your competency is brought into question, attorneys don't want to represent you, not until you're cleared. So that's basically where I'm at. Thank you for watching. If you watched this far, that's kind of a long story, but that was just the basics. There's a lot more to it. We got some documentation, some recordings, some video, some audio. I will be happy to provide that to people. I just got to make sure they're the right people. I don't want to give this out to people who are going to, use it in a way that's inappropriate. And due to the nature of some of these materials, it can be used that way. So thank you again for watching. For all you people out there who are pushing back against corruption, I see ya. I feel ya. I'm going through the same stuff as you. Stay strong.